My name is Jeryl Hayes. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Movement Building Director at If, When, How, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice. I am honored to be with you all today to share my expertise on public policy, the reproductive justice movement, and how we can use the reproductive justice framework as a model for social change. Before we get started, I'd like to share a little about my organization. If, When, How, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice is a national nonprofit that trains, networks, and mobilizes law students and legal professionals to work within and beyond the legal system to champion reproductive justice. To us, lawyering for reproductive justice is a concept and practice that we are committed to developing in meaningful partnership with those most impacted and affected by reproductive oppression, which is integral to the goal of achieving reproductive justice. So this presentation will explore the concepts of reproductive justice, racial justice, and movement building, and how advocates can use social science to transform the law and policy landscape through advocacy, support, and organizing, so that all people have the power to determine if, when, and how to define, create, and sustain families with dignity, and to actualize sexual and reproductive well-being on their own terms. The first part of this presentation is an excerpt from a larger training that we do with our law students, legal fellows, lawyers, and activists to understand a concept that we call RJ squared, because understanding the connections between reproductive justice and racial justice is extremely important and in fact vital to reproductive justice work. We must understand this framework and vision to actively practice RJ squared as reproductive justice advocates. I'll also include a disclaimer here that we generally use gender-neutral language, but will occasionally need to deviate in order to relay statistics accurately. So, what is reproductive justice? Reproductive justice is a framework that was developed and continues to be led by women of color who noted that their specific experiences were not fully represented or prioritized in either the civil rights movement or the women's movement. The term was specifically coined in 1994 by a group of 12 Black women in Chicago who believed the traditional choice framework failed to take into account the economic, social, demographic, and geographic circumstances that prohibited their communities from having any real meaningful choice about their reproductive health and destinies. The actual term comes from a combination of the terms reproductive rights and social justice. The reproductive justice framework uses a human rights framework that centers the people most at risk of reproductive oppression. And at the root of reproductive justice is a focus on racial justice, economic justice, immigrant justice, gender justice, disability justice, and LGBTQ liberation, with a critical understanding of the connections between these movements. If, When, How envisions reproductive justice to be an essential transformation of the systems and institutions that perpetuate oppression into structures that realize justice, and a future when all people can self-determine their reproductive lives free from discrimination, coercion, or violence. The three major tenets of reproductive justice includes the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to parent the children you have in a safe and healthy environment. There's also a fourth right that is considered a newer tenet of reproductive justice, which is the right to bodily autonomy. Let's dive a little deeper into each of these tenets. So the first tenet, the right to have children, includes family formation and who can become a parent, freedom from coerced sterilization, access to assisted reproductive technology and adoption, and support for young parents. In thinking about family formation, who is considered a family and who can become a parent includes what legal protections and entitlements folks have when it comes to being able to have a family, which impacts LGBTQ people, but also single people, people struggling with infertility, and people who form families through other non-traditional means. having their family structures recognized and supported. And thinking about the ongoing history and reality of forced sterilization in this country and how this impacts BIPOC communities, which is Black, Indigenous, and people of color, incarcerated people, people with disabilities, and immigrants. We also know that people who are affected by the criminal justice system have faced pressure to submit to sterilization as a condition of parole or probation. And in some places, trans folks might face requirements to undergo gender confirmation surgery in order to have their gender recognized, which could have an impact on their ability to have children how they want to, or they may face discrimination in trying to become a parent and access assisted reproductive technology or obstetrical care. We also have a history of coercion around long-acting reversible contraception among communities of color and young people. And the fact that sometimes intrauterine device IUD insertion is covered by insurance, but the removal is not. The right to not have children is also a tenet of reproductive justice and recognizes that access to contraception and abortion care should not be limited or restricted based on political or religious interference. Every person should have the right to determine for themselves their reproductive lives, which includes the self-determination about when not to have children, having access to the full range of contraception options, including sterilization, should have access to safe, affordable abortion care, and the right to determine whether to access abortion in a clinical setting or to self-manage their abortion safe at home. And the right to parent the children we have includes having the resources to be able to parent with dignity, access to parental leave, lactation support, access to public benefits and the elimination of welfare family caps, safety from violence, the child welfare system, and family separation as just a few of the issues related to the right to parent the children we have. So people often ask about the difference between reproductive justice and the other frameworks. The other frameworks include the reproductive rights framework and the reproductive health framework. So let's take each of these and talk a little bit about how each of these frameworks work. So for reproductive rights, there's a focus on the legal right to reproductive health care. That includes advocacy, policy, legislation, and litigation. Reproductive health focuses on the provision of healthcare, and that includes providers, physicians, nurse practitioners, clinic staff, and patients. And the reproductive justice framework uses a human rights framework that addresses both systemic and individual oppressions. And a single organization or advocate can work within multiple frameworks. In fact, we think of these three frameworks as being related, but not interchangeable. We tend to think of them as three legs of a stool, needing each component to move forward in order to advance reproductive freedom. There are a variety of reproductive health issues and services that relate to reproductive justice. These include contraception, sterilization, abortion, prenatal care, labor and delivery, postpartum care, sexually transmitted infection and disease prevention, testing and treatment, and comprehensive sex education. But one of the benefits of the reproductive justice framework is that it expands beyond more than just family planning. So reproductive justice includes a holistic view of what people need to thrive and includes broader issues that affects anyone's ability to thrive both as an individual and as a community. These issues include food deserts, affordable housing, quality education, livable wages, safety net programs, reliable and safe transportation, climate change, and freedom from state-based and domestic violence. As an example of using the reproductive justice framework, we look at something like birth justice, which includes access to culturally competent, affordable, and preferred care, including doulas and midwives, autonomy and dignity in birth experiences, freedom from obstetric violence and coercion, and addressing racial disparities and maternal mortality. The right to have children and parent the children we have includes how those children come into the world. In addition to the ability to have birth experiences in the setting and with the provider that a pregnant person chooses, this also includes culturally competent care for trans, non-binary, and gender nonconforming pregnant people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, undocumented folks, and others who have faced discrimination or mistreatment in healthcare. Using the reproductive justice frame allows us to think about not just the legal rights required to make these things a reality, like the legal right to have a home birth, but also the resources and conditions that are necessary for people to truly access and realize these things in their lives, like insurance and Medicaid coverage for doula and midwifery services, and real shifts in how healthcare providers treat patients. This includes access to healthcare and the freedom from things like shackling for pregnant people who are incarcerated or in immigration detention. So if when how uses this phrase RJ squared, because to us, reproductive justice is racial justice and racial justice is reproductive justice. Communities of color have a long history of barriers that precluded them from exercising real, meaningful choice about their reproductive health and lives. And if we ignore this reality, we will be completely ignoring the history and principles of reproductive justice. So what is racial justice? Well, we use a definition that is defined from Race Forward, and you can find more information at raceforward.org. And racial justice is the systematic, fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. Like reproductive justice, racial justice focuses on all folks being able to access and exercise their legal rights. So racial justice includes dismantling discriminatory systems and institutions, acknowledging disparities and inequities and then addressing them, valuing the autonomy of all people, supporting and centering the people most affected by injustice, ensuring access to the resources people need to thrive, advocating for safe workplaces, schools, and streets, creating equitable policies and practices, amplifying the voices and experiences of people of color, fighting implicit and explicit bias, and dismantling white supremacy. So analyzing with an RJ lens means taking a hard, critical look beyond facial words and meaning. It means questioning who is being affected, both directly and indirectly. It means evaluating intent versus impact. It means digging deeper to identify who benefits and who is harmed. And it means bringing issues of race, class, religion, immigration status, and other identity factors into the conversation because every part of a person's identity contributes to how folks are affected. So let's look at a few RJ issues with both a reproductive and racial justice lens. So RJ squared means dismantling discriminatory systems and institutions. As an example, until the late 1970s, federally funded sterilization programs operated in 32 states and specifically targeted Black, Native women, and Latinas. By using a critical RJ lens, we see that forced sterilization was a discriminatory, systematic, state-sanctioned policy. This has a devastating impact on people of color and their ability to make decisions regarding how to parent with dignity, free from coercion or violence. RJ squared also means supporting and centering the people most affected by injustice. So another example is that people of color are disproportionately affected by poverty, violence, HIV/AIDS, discrimination, and harmful policies like the Hyde Amendment. You might be familiar with the Hyde Amendment, which is a federal policy that bars federal funding for abortion care. This means that anyone receiving Medicaid health insurance, mostly low-income individuals and families, would become ineligible to have their insurance cover their abortion health care. Height is a reproductive justice issue because it affects a person's ability to afford the reproductive health care they need. And Hyde may look like a neutral policy limiting government funding, but by viewing this through an analytical RJ lens, we can see that these laws actually target certain groups of people, specifically low-income people of color, who are hurt most by these policies. So our identities are intersectional because our lives are multidimensional. I'm sure you've heard of the word intersectionality, which was coined by brilliant law professor, race theorist, and civil rights activist Kimberly Crenshaw, and was created to explain the unique oppressions, biases, and violence that Black women face. Intersectionality is a lens to see through, where we can see how power comes together, where it collides, and where it interlocks and intersects. In any given situation, it's not simply that there's a race problem, a gender problem, or a class problem. Using a single issue framework like that is harmful because it erases the impact on folks who are subject to all of these things. Intersectionality is a more holistic view, and practicing intersectionality in our justice work ensures that we don't leave people behind. We also want to include just a few definitions. So oppression is the systematic devaluing of certain identities in contrast to a privileged norm, meaning certain groups are denied something of values while others have ready access, and systemic lack of representation or misrepresentation, for example, in the media. And privilege, which is unearned social power, which is usually invisible to those who have it. And this is the concept of having your identity be centered or treated as the standard. We know that oppression exists in all our lives. We interact with it every day in our regular routines, whether at work, at school, with family, with friends, in restaurants, or other public places. With oppression and privilege also comes implicit and explicit biases. Now let's talk a little more about levels of oppression. These are just a few of the definitions. We've got institutional oppression, which is to establish standards in our system. Cultural oppression, which is an expression of superiority of a group's culture, heritage, or value. Personal oppression, which is internal beliefs about certain groups of people being inferior. And interpersonal oppression, which is how we behave in light of the assumptions we have about other groups of people. Everyone is influenced by institutional and cultural oppression, which inform the way that folks project personal and interpersonal oppression onto others. This can happen both actively or unconsciously. Inequality is able to thrive because these different types of oppressions adapt and live on in multiple levels. They work together, where we are all experiencing and projecting multiple dimensions of oppression at any given time. And these can be learned directly or indirectly, either taught by family or cultural customs, or caught through mass media or personal relationships. It's important for us to have a sense of what these levels of oppression are so that we can actually address them. So RJ squared is how we can continue to analyze using this explicit lens. We must actively question who is being directly and indirectly affected, evaluate intent versus impact, dig deeper to identify who benefits and who is harmed, bring intersectional identity factors into the conversation, and understand the different levels of oppression. Again, justice is multidimensional, and there is no one-size-fits-all solution. So now that we've talked through RJ squared, let's talk about movement building. What is movement building? Well, at its heart, it's organizing people to work towards a collective vision and goal. It should be based on shared values, and the most effective movement building moves at the speed of trust, meaning trust between partners and trust that you're working towards the same goals. At If, When, How, the heart of our movement building is relationships and community, and specifically centering people, not just concepts or theories, which is at the core of our work. For centering people, that involves acknowledging the intersection of identities and understanding the different intersecting oppressions and working towards solutions that can meet multiple needs. Centering people also involves collaborating across disciplines, including multi-pronged solutions like policy advocacy, organizing, training, and research, and critically transforming legal, political, and economic systems by working to address systemic issues at large. In reproductive justice lawyering, we employ multiple avenues for change, including different legal theories for change. That includes access to justice, because we know that increased access to judicial system can improve outcomes for marginalized people. Looking at law reform, because legal victories can lead to social change. And working to democratize legal tools and knowledge that can lead to social change. The role of researchers is critically important to moving forward public policy. So let's talk a little bit about what can be at stake. We know that research and data are regularly used in decisions made by people in power. That critical, comprehensive research is vital to getting a full picture of what data is telling us, and that research and data are crucial components in advancing public policy. But we also know that not all research and data can tell the full story or the full picture if it's not taking into consideration all of the different stories and lived experiences that are at stake. So data can be used to tell the stories of what's happening behind the numbers. And here are some questions to ask. What is the presumed default identity here? What identities or experiences are being represented? Whose identities are missing? Is there a unique perspective to add? Can this platform be used to include others? And what else is missing from the conversation? So looking at what is present and what is missing can help make sure that data can tell the full story. All right, so let's recap how reproductive justice framework can be used as a model. Again, reproductive justice centers the most marginalized and lifts up impacted communities, identifies the systems of oppression and discrimination, actively fights against explicit and implicit biases, works in partnership with communities, works to educate peers and call for systemic change, and acknowledges the work of people of color. I'd love to talk to you all about questions that you have or discussions about any points of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeryl. That was such a great presentation, and I'm so happy we have you here in person. So everyone, go ahead and post questions in the chat. I'm going to be kind of moderating and juggling the questions for us, so Jeryl can just focus on her thoughts. And if you prefer to post your question privately to me in the chat, that's fine too. You don't have to make it public. So as people are together, I just have a couple questions to start with. The first is, you mentioned that the RJ movement was really founded by women of color and particularly Black women. And you also mentioned that Kimberly Crenshaw was sort of the person who coined the term intersectionality and put a lot of those concepts in place in the way that we still use them today. Why is it so crucial for us to both know and speak about the people who came before us in these social movements and to recognize their contributions?
Thank you. And thank you all for getting to be with you today. So one of the reasons that this is such a great question is we know what happens when histories get erased, when people who have put their hearts and souls and blood and sweat into movements then don't get credit, or their work gets misconstrued, and they're not having the opportunity to really explain, this is what is behind this work. This is how this work got started. This is how we centered ourselves. This is how we centered our own experiences. We see what happens, throughout history when those experiences aren't accurately documented or accurately contributed to the folks who are, who created. And so it's so vital and important to really acknowledge those who have come before us, those who have put in the hard work and effort, and making sure that their work gets credited to the folks who have put in the effort. We still have among us working in the reproductive justice movements. Several of the 12 Black women are still active today, including Tony Bond, who is a PhD and working actually at the intersection of reproductive justice and interfaith work. We also have Loretta Ross, who is the founder of Sister Song, which is one of the first organizations that specifically focused on reproductive justice and how to work within the larger repro movement to make sure that these particular perspectives and viewpoints are not just present and acknowledged, but are also centered and are factors in ways that we can make sure that the people who are most impacted and most at risk of different types of oppression, that they are part of the solutions, that theories and policy that doesn't take into account their lived experiences actually can be harmful if it's not fully addressing what their needs are. And so making sure that those folks are present and part of the solution. So it's really important to make sure that the folks who really put forth this effort, who really spent a lot of their time and expertise are credited. So thank you for that question.
Great, thank you. We have a question in the chat from Tracy McFarlane, who says, since the legal protections might vary across the world, what are the possibilities for international coalitions for reproductive justice? To what extent do they exist?
That's a really great question, and particularly for reproductive justice, because it was using a human rights framework, which is an international framework, that there is work that happens across, not just within the US, but across continents. So particularly for the legal protections, that's a little bit more tenuous, in part because the legal work that happens in the US is primarily focused on either federal policy or state-based policy. So even sometimes those two, even federal policy and state policy have to work so differently because the strategies are very different because of how slow things happen at the federal level versus how much quicker things can happen at the state level. And it's a little bit similar between the US policy and international policy, in part because for so long, political leaders in power for our country don't put as much stake in some of the international laws, some of the larger human rights laws, which makes it really challenging for activists, particularly for legal activists, to really make the case in the US around using the human rights framework when the US has not ratified some of the major international policies. That makes it much more challenging. But there is work that happens at the international level. There are several conferences that happen where folks get together and really talk through what are the different strategies that folks are utilizing, what has worked well, what are the lessons learned from challenging situations, and particularly looking to celebrate some of the international victories that have happened recently, and learning what are some of those strategies that we can employ to better influence the work that's happening in individual countries. But it's much more challenging from a legal perspective, just because of the different laws that are at play and how challenging it already is in the US, both with the federal laws and the state laws. There's a lot of effort that's already being expanded there.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question from Kelly who says, "I'd love to hear your thoughts about the connections between RJ and climate change, especially since it has been shown that climate change has a disproportionate impact on BIPOC and women."
Yes, so there's actually the environmental justice movement is a movement that is at the intersection of reproductive justice and environmental climate change issues. And in several of the environmental justice work really is actually lifting up the specific disproportionate impact on BIPOC and women, in particular the ways that different policies relating to environmental aspects are not actually taking into account the disparate economic situations that folks are in. We also see this happening too in the international realm as well, because of the how economic security is tied to being able to have land available, to having water available, to being able to utilize the land in a lot of places, and how again that disparate impact because of climate change, that it's not, it doesn't affect us all equally. We do, there is a difference based on what your economic situation is. One of the other aspects of environmental justice that is tied to reproductive health is the disproportionate impact on reproductive health challenges because of environmental factors, such as, if there's pollution that's happening, if there are fumes that are happening, that there is more and more research around the connection between those environmental factors. And if somebody miscarries or if somebody has infertility issues. And so there is a lot of looking into those connections and looking at what are the circumstances of somebody's employment that might have an environmental impact in relation to their fertility status. So as a very specific example, there was work that happened around looking at nail salons because of the different chemicals that are being used, because the conditions, the employment conditions weren't including enough protections for those workers who were disproportionately women, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately people whose immigration status meant that they may not be able to push back as hard on their employees because of the circumstances, and looking at their reproductive outcomes where they were experiencing higher rates of miscarriages, higher rates of infertility, and really working to reform those, getting OSHA involved, getting, other policy involved to make sure that the employers are creating safe environmental workspaces for their employees, because they're seeing the reproductive harm that was happening. So there is a lot of work that that's not an area that my organization focuses on. So I want to make sure to give credit to the organizations that are most specifically focusing on that connection between reproductive justice and climate change. There is a lot of work that is happening there. It's just not the primary work of my organization.
Thank you. And I love that question from Kelly, because really, I think if we picked any topic out of this whole conference program out of a hat, there would be a strong connection between that topic and reproductive justice, right? It just intersects with every facet of life and every topic that we're interested in as psychologists. So I really thank you, Kelly, for asking that.
And I will say one of the things that one of the reasons that's such a great question is this is one of the reasons the reproductive justice framework is such a helpful framework, because it is broad enough to allow for connections to other movements. And that's one of the ways that we have actually found to have success is one, recognizing that the systems of oppression that we're sort of facing, that generally the same people who are pushing back against, abortion care, against contraceptive care, against, prenatal care, are also the same people who are pushing back against, the social safety net programs, making sure that people have access to affordable housing, that people have access to economic, growth and opportunities through living wages. That, generally speaking, there are some of the same players who are impacting and who are really, the root causes of these different forms of oppression. And that in order for us to be successful, we really have to work across our different disciplines and across our different movements and find those points of connection and find those points of, of seeing each other's, the struggles that we're having, where oppression is coming in, and by understanding, like, all of these different movements are connected and not being super siloed in each of the movements, it actually allows for us to have better success because our collective power is so much stronger than any individual movement. If we really band together and understand that, people having access to living wages, having access to healthcare, who don't have to use their rent to pay for medication. If they're able to have, both of those things covered, then, that impacts the work that is going towards helping folks who are unhoused. So understanding all of those connections means that we can actually better address the different oppressions that folks are facing, and we have a better opportunity for solutions that are multi-pronged. That people, again, because our lives are multidimensional, our solutions need to be based in broader understanding those broader contexts, so that the solutions are actually helping in helping to address multiple needs.
Yes, thank you so much. I love that way of thinking about it. And I think that that broad sort of multidisciplinary, multi-pronged way of thinking really should apply to us as researchers as well, as we're thinking about how to ask research questions and how to investigate those questions. So I want to sort of bring the conversation in that direction to sort of the data side. I'm curious, you mentioned that some of the core concepts of reproductive justice are the most marginalized folks sort of at the center of the movement, working in partnership with communities. And I'm curious how you think researchers can incorporate those principles into the work we're doing so that we can be better advocates for people on the ground in social movements like you.
Yeah, so there's a lot, there's been a lot of conversation, particularly in the past 5 to 7 years, about, in particular in the reproductive and the larger sort of repro space, about, what are the questions that are being asked and how can we use the research in a way that actually, like I said, that tells the full picture. Because sometimes what was happening is that research questions were very tailored to a specific experience and are asking only of particular, folks of a particular background or particular socioeconomic status, and not including a much broader range of folks, who have different lived experiences, who have different barriers that they're facing, and not taking into account how those other barriers might come into play. For example, if you're thinking about in the abortion context, if you're looking at how people access abortion care, if you're not factoring in some of those additional factors, for example, if somebody, because of their immigration status, may not go to a clinic because there's a checkpoint that's set up, right before you get to a clinic, that those are tactics that are being used by ICE and other immigration officials to deter people from going to get reproductive health care. If you're not factoring in that might be a reason that somebody's not going and accessing care, they're not getting counted in the data, or they're not getting counted in how we're thinking about, how people access care. If you're not taking into account that somebody, might have an appointment, but because they are working in a low-wage job or a job where they don't have access to paid sick leave, that they're not able to access their appointment because they can't get the time off, or they would have to choose between their job and going to get the care that they need. If you're not understanding those different parameters and those different experiences coming in, then the data might miss who is actually being impacted by restrictions that are happening. And so being able to broaden the questions that we're asking, being able to make sure that, looking for different data points and not just, what you might expect to see, and making sure that you're factoring in what could be other reasons that we're looking at. If we're looking at numbers, what could be other factors, especially other factors that are related to socioeconomic statuses. So those are some of the questions that, when we talk to researchers and we say, hey, we need you to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, we start to see a better picture of what is happening. And the reason that is so important is because when we are going into, the halls of Congress and working with, like, for example, with members of the pro-choice caucus, for example, who we work closely with some of the legislation for different issues that are most important to us, they want to know, how does this impact somebody in my district? How does this impact different communities? And by being able to have data that more broadly shows the bigger picture, that shows a more accurate picture, that's power that we have as activists. Those are tools that help us get to the end goals, because because that research can show a more accurate picture, because it is taking into account more of the lived experiences, more of the reasons, and taking a more critical look at what might be showing up for people, what might be more of the story behind why we're seeing the numbers in the way that we are.
Awesome, thank you. What a good inspiration for all of us for the rest of the time. I just wanted to ask one last really kind of short question in our last couple minutes here, because a brand new topic that we've never had at any previous SPSSI conferences is, of course, the pandemic. And now suddenly we have tons and tons of talks and sessions that are on the pandemic. And so I just was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how the pandemic relates to these themes of reproductive justice, or how it's impacted your work as a movement building director.
Absolutely, that's a really great question. I think something that we've seen through the pandemic is that it has exacerbated situations that were already present. So inequity in terms of access to reproductive health care just got so much harder through the pandemic. So we were already experiencing places where folks didn't have reproductive health care in their communities. They didn't have providers who were available, or because of other federal policies, they were no longer able to use, if they were able to go to get their reproductive health care from Title X clinics, because of restrictions that were happening at the federal level, they were no longer able to access that care in their communities, and were having to travel much further to get that care. And then with the pandemic, then we saw, that folks who, because they were isolated, because they couldn't get to clinics, or because states were determining that their reproductive health care wasn't essential, and so they were shutting down the opportunities for folks to have access to that care. All of those things were exacerbated by the pandemic, and made so much more challenging and harder to get to. One of the economic issues that we also saw was people who are accessing healthcare, who have challenges with having basic healthcare because they're not working in jobs that provide health insurance, or they're working multiple jobs, multiple part-time jobs. They're trying to sort of stitch together their economic system, and they don't have healthcare coverage. the pandemic just made things that much harder for them to stay healthy to begin with. And we know, whether you're trying not to have children, or if you're trying to parent, being healthy is an important aspect of being able to parent. And so the pandemic really just highlighted so much of what is already present, so much of the disparities that are already happening in our healthcare system, in our socioeconomic system. And we've just seen, an increase of that. In particular, for my organization, two of the major issues that were impacted by the pandemic were people accessing self-managed abortion care, because that became a much bigger option for folks. And then also for young people who needed to access, who needed to get a judicial bypass because of the rules in their state. That work became much harder because in some states they were deeming, a young person petitioning to a judge to be able to get a judicial bypass. They were saying that wasn't essential work, and in some states they weren't even able to access the judicial systems. And we were pushing hard to make sure that young people were able to get the care that they needed. So those are some of the ways that the pandemic has impacted us. But we're also seeing, that those are some of the negative ways. We're also seeing some of the positive ways, which is that the pandemic forced many organizations, many folks to really understand what is the most essential in how people work, and that different types of accommodations that folks have been asking for in the years sort of leading to the pandemic actually became really clear that people can work from home and still be and still be productive. That being able to work from home, and people are juggling the needs of childcare. We really saw the ways that had people having flexibility in their work life could mean that that it became a little bit easier to manage their households and manage childcare or help with the parenting aspect, to have more flexibility, and that wasn't going to that organizations and companies offering much more flexible schedules is beneficial to families, and that should be a practice that continues forward. So we're seeing some of the ways that accommodations actually can be made, and we hope that some of that work continues forward.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we have reached the end of our time. I'm sure if we were in person, a huge round of applause, but sadly we are just on Zoom. So we'll just have to silently thank you so much for being here. It's been so inspirational. I'm so excited about this being such a great way to kick off the conference. And I think these themes can keep running through our minds as we watch all of the sessions that are coming up this week.